Welcome, and thank you for tuning in. You're listening to the Beyond 50 radio program. I'm Daniel Davis. Many of you who have tuned into the program over the years have come to understand that by the time you're in midlife, it's time to consider perhaps writing that memoir to sort of leave a print to the world about who you are and what you brought into this world as your special gift. Many times those people get started on embarking on writing, they find themselves tangled in finding difficulties on how to get that message out. So what do? You go and you take yourself a writing class. Perhaps you join a writing club or group. Or most importantly, maybe you go back to college and you take up courses in writing. And although they may give you some of the mechanics and the engineering of what writing is all about, nothing can help you more than when you can find a way to tap into the subconscious to free the writing and the writer itself. On our program today, we're joined by a guest who likes to teach about the dozens of gateways to the subconscious world, which can help you to release the genius of your intuitive mind to be a better writer. He explains that a powerful writing comes naturally when your mind is energized and experimental, when it can take risks and follow the unexpected wherever it leads. His book is Writing the Open Mind, Tapping the Subconscious to Free the Writing and the Writer. I'd like to welcome to the Beyond 50 radio program today our guest, Andy Couturier. Andy, thank you for joining us here on the Beyond 50 radio program.
No, thank you for having me. I'm glad to be here.
What clearly emerges in your book as people begin to read this, and you don't just sit and read this, obviously, you dive right into exercises. We got to get this thing shaken up here, but you really touch on something that I think is so important is when people approach a particular thing they feel they're interested in doing, it's like their analytical mind jumps in and comes up with all the things, reasons for maybe why they shouldn't do it or they're not ready, those kinds of things that challenge people. I know that when I have had guests on the program, they've never done radio, one of the things I'll typically hear is, well, do you think I could talk to the host before we get started? Because obviously they're nervous. And they're concerned about whether they sound good or whether they're going to be this or that or the other thing. And, that critic is just there, isn't it?
Yeah, and it's not just there when we were born. It's been put into us by our society and by a series of rules and conventions, and maybe even some of those, suggestions or ideas where they're intended to help us, but in fact they often strengthen that part of the mind. We call it the critic, but if you want to think about it in a logical sense, brain sense, it's that prefrontal cortex that's always evaluating, and it's a very important part of the mind. We couldn't even, dial a phone or get from one place to another without it. People who have that part of their brain injured are really in trouble, but when it becomes so powerful that the other dreaming part of the mind or the guess-making part of the mind or the risk-taking part of the mind is constantly shut down by it, then people retreat into fear.
Now, just to let you know, this is only the second book that I've really ever read on writing. The first one being Stephen King on writing. Right. And I see that how the two of you really have a lot of similar ways to approach this. And I remember it was an interesting story that he shares in his book, that there was a point where he had actually went out and bought what he called the 6-foot-long monstrosity known as a desk, puts it in a corner, sets it up, and he says for the next 6 years he spent his time just basically being drunk. But the bottom line he was saying is, look, you've got to create that space, but when you go to sit down, you're specifically sitting down to write. That writing is a habit, and that's a lot of what you talk about in your book.
Yeah, and really, it's many people when they sit down to write, there's something about sitting down which is in some sense a stop, right? In terms of stop and go or pause. There's a thought that we're like kind of stopping, but what we really want is to give the go message to the mind, the go message to the pen. There's a great French philosopher who said, it is the pen which dreams. C'est le stylo qui rêve. It is the pen which dreams. So how do we let that pen dream? And I think it's really about peeling away the onion skin layers of all the things that our society has told us stop us. And so it's not just having the desk. In fact, you don't really even need a desk. You just need a stub of a pencil and scraps of paper, really. But whatever is comfortable for you, and just trying to get into the place without saying, now be creative. That's actually using that same part of your mind. that is evaluating and criticizing, but just peeling away. And I could share those with you, some of those things that I say when I start every class that I teach.
Now, I was going to say, too, it was interesting because when we get to what I was alluding to earlier about that inner critic or that voice,
yeah,
I think one of the first steps is, as we grow up and we think to ourselves, we actually want to write something, put something down on paper, perhaps possibly share it with the world. We have a lot of interesting ideas of what a writer actually is, and you talk about that.
Well, I mean, we have these thanks for reading the book. I appreciate that. It's a fun book. So, yeah, this idea, we usually have this capital W writer, and that person is a famous person, and that person is a bestseller, and that person is a published author, and it becomes so high that, first of all, any word that we come out becomes, trashy or terrible in comparison with this, exalted choir of angel ideals that we hold in our minds. Yeah, it's really just anybody who writes, and this whole set of the star system that, kind of infiltrates from Hollywood, that there's like the losers and the champions. That's actually, paradoxically, once you start thinking that way, you're much less likely to write something original and interesting and exciting because you're constantly evaluating each word and sentence against that unattainable ideal of perfection.
Such as Stephen King would say, when you write something, you get rid of it for a while. You don't sit there, because if you try to actually sit there and edit what you've just written, you'll never get anything done.
Yeah, you put it aside, and that's what I tell students in my class, is just race ahead to the end. Whatever it is you're writing. I mean, I teach book completion groups, as well as writing from the subconscious and other things, writing from nature, writing in nature, writing from the body. But often people will I have to get the first page right. I have to get the first chapter right, because if I don't get the first chapter right, how do I know, that I'm going in the right direction? And I generally disagree with that. I say just keep the pen moving, or keep the keyboard clacking. Move ahead as quickly as possible. Don't read back. Don't scratch out. Just head forward. And along the way, you might find energy rising. You might find passion kind of surface. And you might even not notice where the energy has risen until you go back and take a look at it. And from there, then you can say, oh, that's actually the voice I want, or that's really what I want to write about. I sort of thought I wanted to write about my divorce, but maybe I wanted to write about how after the divorce there was a particular form of grieving that had this wintry sensation that was a snowstorm, that was painful, but there was a beauty to it. But you don't know that until you keep writing. I just made that up on the spot. I mean, that's how this comes out. I speak from the subconscious. You head forward and you trust that you're going to come upon something that's interesting. I like to call it the golden paragraph, where from there you can then see where you really want to go to and what's really important to you. And maybe you write that first chapter last, because you sort of know where you're going at that point.
And you mentioned something that's very valuable, and I love sharing this with people from time to time, and it's that place where you find yourself and you lose yourself all at the same time. As I like to describe, it's where somehow you just know something is working through you and you lose yourself.
Yeah.
And then it's like you become conscious again and go, wow, I know I experienced that, I know I did that, but that didn't feel like it came from me. And there are times that when I broadcast a show, and I'm certain that that's probably going to happen during this hour here, but that when you experience that, you think, how do I get more of that? Because it just blows your mind that your mind was gone, that something worked through you. But it takes a little bit of effort and exercise to get to that point.
Yeah. Well, maybe this would be a good point to share how I start all my classes, with just a few things, guidances. And I'm very interested in not just the mind or just the ideas, but also the physical body, the sound of the language, but also just making yourself physically comfortable. And then releasing all these ideas of competition or what good writing is, and just telling yourself you can write about anything at all, that you really do welcome anything that comes to your mind, even if it seems off topic, even if it seems you work for ideas that are interesting to you. You follow your own pleasure. This is a very revolutionary way of thinking about writing, because most people think about school in general and writing in particular as this place of pain and suffering, and that about writing you sit down at the desk and blood drops form on your forehead and it's all suffering. I don't actually think that's the way to write well, and I don't think that's a great way to live your life either. But if you follow your own excitement, interest, pleasure in writing, whether that's the pleasure in the word sounds themselves, whether it's pleasure in the ideas, or even if you're writing about something difficult, if there's something that's or powerful in it, if you follow that, you're more likely to actually create something unusual. The reason I think that is a short example or short explanation here. You have 100 billion brain cells, right? And they're all connected in these millions of neural networks and synapses connecting. And the way those synapses connect depend on everything that's made you who you are, your DNA, the way your parents raised you, the languages you spoke, whether you grew up in a hot place, a cold place, whether you played violin. All of these things are making a complete start to put on top of that, like there's a proper way to construct a sentence, and there's a beginning, middle, and end, and I read this book on structure, and it has to, memoir should have the 5 different parts and the 8 different reasons. You're actually contradicting that sort of rich mangrove swamp of your own brain that is so beautiful if you just look at the roots and the branches of those trees. And if you follow your own pleasure, you're actually likely to make something either strictly beautiful or not replicable by anybody else. So it's really about, just getting to that place where you know what's going to happen next, and you're excited and you're rushing forward. And if you give yourself those permissions and those excitements, you're going to get lost, just like you said there, Daniel, about or you're likely to get lost. And it's never guaranteed. That's the thing, is if you need it to happen, then it likely won't. But if you're open to it might happen to you, then it's possible that you're going to write something back at you. Say, I don't think anyone. What we're after, I think, is to try to add something to the world, to give something to the world that's not.
Yeah, it's interesting because as I was reading the book, I was thinking about how sometimes it comes out of you at the most interesting times. And there was a time some years back, about a year after we first moved into the house we're in now, where all of a sudden there appeared on our back deck these 3 little kittens. Apparently their mother was nowhere to be found, but they kept showing up, and it was interesting because I was just sitting there on a kind of a lazy afternoon as I was watching them back there on the deck, and I picked up a piece of paper and began to describe what I was seeing. Okay, so first you have kittens. So I thought, well, let's make this kind of cute. So I thought, smitten, mitten, kittens. And then because it was 3, they were a smitten, mitten, kitten coalition. And I just kept going with that, seeing how much we could extend it. And I think the reason I even thought of that is I read like some of the sentences in your book, you think, how does he put words together that almost seem so unrelated to each other in a single sentence, but yet the point was made? But that's just it. It's having that reckless abandon sometimes. And I know that there's an interesting memo that I get every Monday morning from a guy out of Texas called the Monday Morning Memo from the Wizard of Ads. And he says, he's big about understanding your business, writing advertising, the right message, for your customers and so forth. And he says, it really doesn't matter how your ad starts out. It's that you eventually get to the point that you want your customers or your potential customers to understand. So you could be selling, for instance, muffins, but that you could talk about traveling to Italy within the first couple of sentences, and then wrap it in to whatever. And it was just really interesting to think. And you pretty much say that your beginning can be the end, and the middle can be the beginning, and all that. And so it's breaking the conventions of what you think it should be, and allowing yourself to just kind of let it out there a little bit.
Yeah. So one way I talk about that is resequencing, is moving things around, and sometimes it's just on a sentence level. People are really stuck about an awkward sentence and say, just take the end and put it at the beginning. Often that's the answer to the first chapter. But it's also sometimes just fun to scramble the words around and see what random chance, as it were, random chance gives you by these coalitions of words that just tumble next to each other without strong intention. That's the emphasis I like to have, is without strong intention. And sure, writing open the mind is rollicking and all over the place, and it's just a playful book. But once I wrote it, I did go back and make sure that the beginning of the sentence ended up, and I could use my rational linear mind. But it's much easier to have something have. Well, let me put it this way: it's much more difficult to give energy to a sentence or to a piece of writing later than it is to clean it up later. So it's better to kind of be a little wild and have a lot of experimentation in your soul and play like a kid. I mean, we all used to do that when we were outside and drawing things on a piece of paper. That total experimental modality of your mind is trustworthy. It's not that it won't occasionally embarrass you or be hard to read, but there may be energy into it. You can clean that up, but it's sort of like cooking. It's better to put the rich spices in there at the beginning and then work on it than to kind of just have something bland and throw cayenne pepper on in the end and hope it'll taste good. So it's really about having a mindset, and I get pretty radical with it. I have a writing from the subconscious class, and I was teaching a few days ago, and I think their eyes sort of got wide, just the kind of ways that we were messing with even standard syntax, but there was a sort of mystery that happened. And from that, you could get a great title for a book, or you could get a great title for a talk, or if you're talking about Italy and muffins, how those two things come together, or coalitions of kittens. That's exactly what we're after is, and we may along the way, but you have to give yourself, and I think that's that word coalition that you used that was the point that really was the departure, right? It was like, wow, sort of went with the sound level, right? The mittens and the kittens and the bitten. About playing with the phonological texture of a language, and from there, this other word popped out, and it was brilliant.
And it's interesting, too, when you read great writing, a lot of times there sometimes seems to be a lot of simplification that by the time you're finished reading it, you think, God, I could have wrote that. One example that I really enjoy was the author of, for instance, Jurassic Park and Westworld. His name eludes me right now, but you read his work and you think to yourself, but there's some really complicated scientific ideas in here, but he puts it in such a way you think to yourself, man, I think I could have actually written something like that. And a lot of people think, how do I get to that level? But the fact is, you get to your own level, find your own ways you talk about. And I know that when there was a time when I was taking a broadcasting course or two, and one of the courses was in commercial writing, and I found myself with that kind of stuckness that I think a lot of people have when they get started with this radio voice in my head that was spewing out this commercial that I would tend to hear on the radio, and it left me stuck because I was actually trying to match that rather than just seeing, well, what's going to come out of me on my own. And, it could be as simple as an idea as well, as you say in the book, you say, sit down and just write a word and then see what follows after that. If you have to write the same word over and over until another word pops in, then that's what you do, but do it. And that's such an interesting starting point.
Yeah, so what's happening in that moment of just writing a word, and I'll come back to the Jurassic Park in a second, but you're actually, whether you're using a keyboard, it tends to work, even more maybe with a pen or pencil in your hand. There's actually pressure on your fingertips, which is actually stimulating your brain. And if you've written before, if you keep writing that same word, it may seem boring, but you're actually giving the yes message to the pen, and you're giving the yes message to your nervous system, and you're saying, I welcome anything. Now, repeating the same word also has a second factor working on it, which is the get sort of frustrated writing that word again, and it's sort of building up energy, and you want to say something else, and maybe even it's a swear word that comes out after that, or maybe you're like, I hate this exercise, or this is never going to work. But as long as you keep the pen moving after this is never going to work, you don't stop, something else surprising can happen. And I've been teaching writing now 20 years, and so I can say from thousands of people that it always does. It always does, as long as you don't stop the pen. To get to the Jurassic Park, a book I haven't read, but say you said there's complex scientific stuff happening there, but the sentences are simple and clear. Often people come in, just like you said about broadcasting, with an idea in their head, like I have to have great dialogue, or I have to have long descriptive sentences, or I shouldn't have long sentences. All long sentences are run-on sentences, which linguistically is actually not true. Or whatever it is that people get in their head that proper, good, high-quality writing is, they try to force their brain to replicate that, which is, even if they were to be successful, it would just be a good copy. Whereas, perhaps this person really just wanted to focus on the scientific ideas, or he had a great plot, and he's like, that's what I'm strong in. Or maybe he's just likes that very, very simple, stripped-down prose. But I can love really, really complicated sentences, or long sentences, or something using a lot of Latinate 4, 5, 6 syllable words, clattering against each other. So when you take some writing book, a very famous one is Elements of Style by Strunk and White, where it says, you must alternate short sentences with long sentences, and people are like, oh, that's how to write. I don't know how to write. I'd like to know how to write properly, and I'll do that. It becomes mechanical, and you're sort of shutting down a part of your brain that could surprise you, or could produce something that's just like you. And that's the trick, is to find out, say for yourself in broadcasting, what is it that you do really well, what is it that you enjoy, and as opposed to focusing on the opposite side of that, the problems, just try to expand that you're really good at, and whatever it is you're doing, if it's writing or broadcasting or writing advertisements, it's going to get stronger. And so that's the philosophy that I have, so that when someone comes in and they say, my plotting's terrible. Well, maybe your book doesn't have a lot of plot. I lived in Japan for many years, and a lot of Japanese literature, it's just not the style to have like a racing plot, at least in traditional Japanese literature. It might be thought of as meandering here, but that's what millions of readers in Japan like and buy, and writers win prizes for. So it's really, really important to just be who you are, even if you're not sure who that is, or it's just emerging as you write.
I was just thinking, and after this we'll go into one of the first exercises you talk about, which you talk about building lists, but what was really interesting, too, is that there are ways that you really describe how you should try to move out of what you don't know you know.
Yes.
And I really like that because, for instance, let's say that you decide to get involved, bring a couple of friends together, and you want to start a writing group, and you decide on a subject that you want to write about, you think, why don't we write on something that we know would make us feel uncomfortable? And, in your book, one example you gave was masturbation. I thought, boy, that'd be interesting in a Southern Baptist Christian group, wouldn't it? But, just imagining, no, go with this, because you might really be surprised that as much as you analytically may think of this as taboo, and you may even believe that if that's what you believe, but if you write about it, you'll start realizing, wow, I didn't really think that much about this before, and that there might be a whole new way that it takes you that you could have never imagined. That's kind of like the Odyssey, isn't it?
It is like the Odyssey. And I use a lot of kind of racy...
Not that we want to put those two words together, but why not?
I think that's what we're talking about, actually, is you take one word from the book, and then the word, the Odyssey, comes up, and then there's this coalition, or this coming together, or what I call asymmetrical juxtaposition of these two themes. And people are probably a little embarrassed listening to this, but there's energy in that embarrassment. So on the very first day of class, I throw out a bunch of really taboo topics. I say, you can write about anything you want to in this class, and then people are not going along. So what that does is, again, gives the prefrontal cortex, judging mind, vacation. It doesn't need to watch everything to make sure that you're not, doing that you're going to be embarrassed about or ashamed of. So I throw out a bunch of examples, and you can write about anything. So you brought up this idea of writing what you don't know you know, and that's based on a technique called automatic writing, is what they called it. Automatic writing up with it the French surrealists in the 1920s. They had just read Sigmund Freud and this idea of the unconscious mind, this idea that there's this part of our brains that or doing things that we haven't even thought of or weren't aware of. And they said, well, what if we could write that way? And so there's a bunch of techniques in writing open the mind to get there, to get yourself to a place where you are able to start writing words that not only had you not planned before you wrote them. So you start from this place when we usually do, planning out what you're going to say, or as I'm speaking now, I'm planning out what I'm going to say. But hopefully I'm not always planning out what I'm going to say. I get to the point where every new word I say or every new word I write is a surprise to me. And lucky you can cross over that border and you're actually writing things and you're sort of checked out. And you don't even know what you wrote. And I've experienced this hundreds of times myself and my students as well, that you read back and there it is in your handwriting, but you didn't even know you thought that. And you think about it a little bit and you think, that's incredibly wise. But it shouldn't surprise us that much, because if you've ever, for example, done dream analysis, putting aside the idea that perhaps dreams come to us from outside of our brains, but we don't know about that. Let's assume that our brains, our minds, our souls produce dreams, and then you analyze it. You're like, wow, I'm getting this great message, or I didn't know this, or this is this important piece of information about my psychology, about my future, about some trauma I went through in my past, and it's in this rich, thickly plotted, surprising world of allegory and spirit animals, or symbols or colors or things that can be drawn from Jungian archetypes. And all that stuff is happening when the prefrontal cortex, the judging mind, is out, is asleep, is gone. So why couldn't we do that when we write? So it's maybe a little bit more complicated than I can explain on the radio, but it is in the book, and it's really about just trying to let go of any convention of what you're going to say and getting to that place of automatic writing so that the words are writing themselves.
You see, and you bring up a really enjoyable exercise, too. I like when I hear a new word or I read a new word that I'm just not used to seeing or hearing.
Uh-huh.
And then trying to find a way to work with that to where I can actually use it in an everyday sentence as though it was a word that I have been using for most of my life. And even furthermore, trying to do it within perhaps writing, saying, how do I use this word, maybe write a paragraph or maybe just a whole story based around just that single word. And it's quite amazing how it really breaks down the mind, and you have to get past that prefrontal cortex, that beta state of thinking, if you will, into an area of creativity, because that's what the mind really wants to be doing.
Yeah. So you wanted to get into an exercise. Do you want me to explain the first one to people here?
Yes, please.
Okay. So this is, and I should mention just before we get started that there's a lot of free resources on my website. If you don't mind, I could say it's theopening.org. And you can also sign up to the mailing list and get free writing tips there. The first one's called cobblings, and I think about both the cobblestone street, but also just sort of cobbling things together. And this is an exercise which brings in a lot of different themes run throughout the book, Writing Open the Mind. But it's also just a quick way, for example, if you have a blog post to write, or a newspaper article, or even a school paper to write, to get a first draft down quickly. And what you do is you hold the theme or topic in your mind, and in my book I throw out a bunch of topics, but it's not a book of writing prompts. This is a bunch of, I like to think about them, chutes and ladders, or funhouse mirrors, or smoke and mirrors, or ways to get you out of your normal track and to give you some techniques to be more playful as opposed to giving you topics. So you think of whatever your topic is. So perhaps your topic is broadcasting, or perhaps your topic is the sudden appearance of animals. So these three kittens appeared in your life? Was there an allegory to it, or is it random? Sudden appearance of animals, and say that's of interest to you, and I'm going to take that since it just came up naturally for you in our conversation. You write that at the top of the page, and what you're going to do is make a series of lists. I'll just talk people through it slowly, but it's also on the website, and you can page about the instructor. And the great thing about lists, before we get into what the lists are, is there's nothing, you can't do a list wrong. There's no, it can be as long as you want to. You can resequence it. You can add anything to it. It gives you the sense of plenty. So you're going to make 5 lists, and they are faces, scenes, ideas, feelings, and questions. And you write, a column on your blank page of those faces, scenes, ideas, feelings, and questions. And then you hold that concept of that you're wanting to write about the sudden appearance of animals. And I know I just gave that to you. I would, in the class, we would talk it out. But if that were your topic, any scenes or situations where animals have shown up, both inside and outside, mountaintops or riversides, any faces, perhaps when your father said you couldn't have a dog, and so you bring dogs home, or your sister brought dogs home and they showed up, and so father, or there's the face of the dog catcher, or there's the face of the exterminator, or there's the lady at the pound, or there's the naturalist bird guide, whatever comes to your mind. And I'm just brainstorming this as we go along. So the mind is inexhaustible. Faces, scenes, ideas, activity, concepts of freedom, concepts of synchronicity, appearance, and you just brainstorm. You don't do one list at a time. You just jump around. Feelings, loss, sorrow, surprise, awe, and then questions, or if you prefer the word mysteries, you could swap that word out. The questions are, you're always supposed to write about what you know. What about writing about what you don't know? Letting that in. So I encourage people to ask questions like, do animals know that we're lonely? Why were there 3 kittens? What happened to the mom? Could be pedestrian questions. Did someone just dump these cats on my backyard? Or is there a larger spirit in the universe that introduced me to playfulness or wanted to nurture my ability to nurture animals? So you see how I'm going with this. And you make you take 7 minutes on an egg timer or a stopwatch, and you get down as many ideas, feelings, faces, scenes, questions as you can. Time's up. You go to step 2. Step 2 is you choose 5 or 7 or 9 of these list items. You choose some of these 9 list items if you have a lot of time, or just 5, and it can be from any one of those questions or feelings, whichever ones are powerful to you, whichever seems to be of interest to you, and that's your second step. And you number them 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 in order. And the thing about that is you're already creating an outline. You're creating an intuitive outline of what would be an interesting place to start. The way you started today was when you told me the story is we started with word sounds, and then you brought up the idea of the kittens, and then you moved from the kittens showing up, the scene of the kittens, to your own writing, and you added in that thing about it being a lazy day. So that was a sequence of writing. So in the similar way, you choose a way to run through it, and not necessarily just to flow through it, maybe to have some radical jumps between them. And once you've numbered them 1 through 9, then you set your timer again, say for 35 minutes, and you get through all 9 of these in that 35 minutes, and that's step 3. Each one will be a chunk of writing. So each word or phrase that's on your list will grow out into its own piece of writing. And when you're finished with that, your 35 minutes, you actually have a first draft, a real first draft of whatever it is you want to write about. And in those jumps between, say, number 3 and number 4, between number 6 and number 7, maybe there's a radical leap. Maybe there's no transition between it. I encourage no transition. And in that, there's a bit of a mystery. There's that radical jump or leap between number 6 and 7 gives your reader a chance to make their own story in it. So that's a quick talk-through of this cobblings exercise. Is there any part that wasn't perfectly clear or you had questions about or wanted to follow up on?
Well, that was interesting when you talk about how you write in segments like that, and even if you're taking a leap, from one to the other, as you suggest, go ahead and do that, because as I was talking about earlier, especially with the Wizard of Ads, it really doesn't matter, what you do there, and as long as that you can go in the direction, and get them to follow you, so to speak.
Mm-hmm.
And it's really interesting to think about that. And while you were describing this, I was just thinking this was an interesting one, because my wife and I were watching a movie the other day, and it reminded me of high school health class, and it was a really fascinating class. Lots of homework. I did very, very well in the class, but each of us, one of the final exams, if you want to even call it exam, but that what we had to do is we had to actually do an oral report on a subject, regarding health. And it was really interesting, because I was just kind of sitting at home, and here I'm a teenager, sophomore year of high school, thinking, what am I going to write about? Now, of course, as the speeches and the reports got turned in, mostly what you were hearing about was drug addiction. Most of it was actually around that, or alcoholism. But mine was, it was funny how the idea just kind of plopped in my lap, and I thought, this would be a fun one. It would blow people's minds, and that's exactly what it did. How to teach your child about sex. What a better subject to talk about in a sophomore year health class.
Right.
And it was really interesting because, I had a lot of fun doing that, describing how you actually, what is suggested to do and so forth. And even the teacher was sitting there smiling like, this is great. It was almost like you could see that look in her face like, boy, this is so refreshing. But it was something, why not? And so I took a shot and did very, very well with it. So.
Yeah, and it was courageous of you, might I say. I think a lot of kids were going towards the drug addiction and alcoholism because they felt from their parental sociological society that they wouldn't get in trouble with each other or with the teacher for, agreeing with general societal prohibition on intoxicating substances. But,
especially when it comes to teenagers and reckless behavior.
Yeah. And you did well with it, and you had fun, and you created a memory that years later you still have.
Now, I know you talk about, for instance, getting involved with writing groups, and you say that sometimes there can be, and danger is the best word that I can come up with at this moment, but it's not that extreme.
Yes, no, danger is a perfect word.
Oh, okay, good. Because as you were talking about that, it was also, a lot like, what Stephen King was talking about in his book a little bit is, writing groups can be okay, but see, they kind of change basically the dynamics of what you're really trying to do in some ways. And one of the things you talked about is as, let's say each one writes in a group their own page, and then it comes to, read what you wrote, and as you say, well, you can decide whether you're going to do that or not. But the worst thing that a person can do is say, well, I really don't know if this is really what I meant, so they actually become the critic to the group before the group even has a chance to listen. So you really share certain, I guess, customs and etiquettes that if you decide to go that direction, which can be a healthy thing, but it can also be a tough thing because it could shut you down as well, and you gave some examples of that. How do we go about approaching this and know when I guess it would just have to feel right, wouldn't it?
Well, yes, I would agree, but actually there are very simple principles that you can work with that you could lay down with your group. So first of all, people often think that the only purpose of showing writing to each other is to criticize. And it's not like if you're about to submit something to a publication or that you've been working on it for a while, you really want to get from your group that, things that they weren't, didn't understand or they got lost in or maybe, meant something different than you thought they meant. That's fine. But we go to that all the time, and many people, they have no other way to interact with someone's writing if someone shows them the writing but to tell them what's wrong with it. And again, that strengthens that critical mind and the what's wrong and better be careful and don't take risks, and that then results in poor writing. So it's actually completely counterproductive. So what you want to do, the way I set up all my writing groups, and I have this here on page 201, I call it Gentle and Generous Principles of Working with Other People. of Writing Open the Mind, and it's at the end, and probably should be there a little earlier, but it's be generous, do not interpret or psychoanalyze, don't tell other people how to fix their piece, don't make it about competition and who is a writer, take your time, and if you don't want to do the same exercise or the same thing as everyone else, don't do it. That's if you're doing free writing together, and there's different kinds of groups. But if you're having a feedback group, everyone brings things in that they wrote at home. What I first start with, the foundation is tell me what words and phrases worked for you. What did you remember? What was interesting to you? What excited you? And the cool thing is you could show a piece of writing to a 12-year-old and say, what did you remember? And you can get great feedback. They don't have to analyze it. And sometimes this analysis just slides into psychoanalysis in kind of scary ways. So you brought up the danger. It was my second time I ever taught a writing class, that I was charging money for. I think it was like $25 for 5 weeks or something like that. I was so nervous about it.
I'll bet you even had that inner critic that says, who are you to be charging that kind of money? What do you think, you're a professional writer?
Exactly.
Which we'll get into here in just a minute, but go ahead.
I wasn't very confident, and I wasn't very experienced. And one woman read a piece, and I said, okay, so let's give some feedback. And a guy, total stranger, brand new, just met each other that night, looks to her and says, you're really on a control trip, aren't you, honey?
Wow, I remember reading that too.
You're really on a control trip. That really, so you don't do that. You don't figure, first of all, we don't even say you when I talk about I. We say the narrator. So I could write something about getting in a car accident and accidentally hitting a child. I've never done that, and it would horrify me to even think about that. But what if I wanted to explore an issue of ethics, or what does a person's life turn into if they do something like that, or just regret in general? I regretted saying something rude at the party, but instead of saying I want to write about something rude at the party, I get into something that I would deeply regret for the rest of my life as a way to look at it ethically. And then if you were in my writing group and you hadn't agreed on the principles, you might say, you're really a horrible person, Andy. Why did you do that? And no, I didn't do that. That's the narrator who did it. Why did you say I did it? So we always talk about the narrator or the speaker, so that allows me to get dangerous or to write about things that might be difficult. We start with reading words and phrases back, and then we say, what did I imagine? What did I remember? What did I dream about when you talked? So, for example, when you were talking about the 3 kittens on your back porch, somehow I imagined it was a dark-stained redwood deck, and it was a big, wide deck, and that the sun was pouring down, and I think you said it was a lazy afternoon, but I imagined you wearing a hat. Now, this may or may not have been true for you, but it gives you a sense that I was engaging with my subconscious mind, with my imaginal faculties, with what you wrote. And then I could say, what I expected to have happen, or what might have come up next, or what did I plan, what I think was going to happen, or where did that connect to something in my life? Not to go too far down my own memory lane, because I want to stay connected with your piece when I'm giving you feedback. But I'm not going in there and saying, 3 kittens is a little bit unbelievable, and maybe 2, but, or if you really want to have it to be an exciting story, make it 20 kittens. And that's called grabbing the steering wheel and telling people how to fix their piece. And
after all, how many dogs have actually had 101 Dalmatians?
Exactly. So it's really, but it's just, you think about 101 Dalmatians. Someone, some point, thought up that idea, and it came to them, and they said yes to it, and it was exciting. So try not to tell people how to fix their piece. Don't criticize them unless that's really what they need. And if someone's a bad listener, say it's not even a writing group, it's just, I've had lots of students get very excited, they're doing really well, and they're feeling good in the group, and they say, well, I showed it to my husband, and it didn't work out. And I was like, oh no, not this again. Because he's trying to help. He's saying, well, I'll criticize it, I'll tell you what's wrong with it. But that's not what she wanted. She wanted the kind of feedback that she might be getting at the opening at my courses, which is, And it's not like just, oh, that was wonderful, great, keep going. I mean, that can be useful too. We can be brave enough to say that may be what we need if the topic is very raw. But I often have people who are more, quote unquote, think about themselves or have their identity as more serious writers say, well, how do you ever know whether it's good or not unless we take a poll? Or everyone in the group tells you what's wrong. And the idea is that by touching into my own subconscious mind of whatever happened to me when I was listening to your writing, that I'm then able to give you feedback on where it's really connecting with one specific individual. And if you have 5 or 7 people, you're going to get a lot of information about which part of your own mind produces powerful writing. And from there, you're going to increase the amount of powerful writing from 30% in a standard piece to 50 to 70 to 90, and that's how you're going to grow your writing, not by telling you what's wrong with that rhyme.
Now, one of the more interesting things now that we have things such as social media and on YouTube, if you post videos, of course, people are allowed to comment. You have more controls nowadays than you used to, say, 4 years ago, but it's really interesting because I kind of wanted to get into, as you talked about just briefly, touched on, was feeling. That's really important because I think that is the subconscious mind trying to break through the prefrontal cortex, the beta state of thinking, to bring out the heart of things. And we had a guest on the program some years back by the name of Byron Katie, and she wrote a book called Loving What Is, 4 Questions That'll Change Your Life. And basically you kind of explore, as those feelings arise about something, where do those things first come from? But the idea is that you're beginning to listen to your mind and then go into your heart is what you're going to do. Now, I have had, and people I'm sure who have a YouTube channel have experienced this from time to time. You get these people that like to troll around, spew all their nonsense all over the thread that has nothing to do with what it was you posted, and they somehow feel good about that. And of course, the more irritating they get towards someone, the more they want to post against that person they're irritating. So apparently that's their goal, is misery, which, hey, fantastic if that's how you want to spend your life. But what I found when I would see these is I would reactionary a response, or I would react a response. Whatever I had going on, I would actually just put it out there. But I wouldn't press send. I would let it get out in the raw first. Then I'd come back to it maybe a few minutes later and I'd go, okay, now this is my intention. I want to steer this into a positive direction, but I got the rawness out. So first of all, this is one of the stupidest conversations I've ever heard. This guy is full of BS, blah, 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 blah. So my reaction would be, probably, who in the hell do you think you are? Blah, blah, blah. What do you know? That sort of thing. That would be your reaction, which is raw. But then I would come back, and it was funny because Byron Katie would kind of step into my mind, and I would think, well, what evidence do you specifically have that this person is full of BS? And it's really interesting when you place that responsibility back on them after getting it out in the raw, then thinking about it, then tightening it up so that you're trying to lead this thread in a positive direction for whatever the subject is, that a lot of times these trolls would just disappear to never be heard from again. All you had to do was just place that responsibility back into their lap. And they're like, well, I'm not going to jar this guy's can, so I might as well go and bug somebody else. But it's funny how that feeling you talk about in the book, that, I guess the reactionary way of things, such as sitting in a group and worrying about, well, I don't know if you'll like it, blah, 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 or whatever the case is. But that's really an important aspect of writing because that can also dig out more creativity to make your writing rich. Wouldn't that be true?
Yeah. And, I think this is a great example, what you brought up about, these internet trolls, these people creating negativity. And I think you said something like, this is one of the stupidest conversations I have ever heard, right? And that's probably just some summary. But instead of responding, you could, of course, ignore it. And I think there is I heard somewhere the rule is never to read the comments on the YouTube channel, but say you want to play with it instead. Instead of reacting, you could actually play with the very language and respond to that person with just their words, but scramble them up in a way that's creative or makes a poem. This herd I of one stupidest conversation, one I of one the herd stupid. Just play with it and then just write them back, as if you're very serious. And every time they get more and more, like a fumarole, spouting steam, you just keep playing with whatever their language is until you show that you're going to stay in the place of creativity and play and fun, whatever, and not react to their intended aggravation complex. So it's really about just trying to bring creativity to all forms of daily life and all forms of language use.
Now, it's funny because in a way, as you read this book, you realize, that in writing there are really no rules, but in a way there is. But here was an interesting thing, that writing in the end, doesn't it convey a story generally? Okay. Now, here's one rule of thumb that I've followed for years from a friend of mine. He says, my mother always told me that when you tell a story, it doesn't have to be true. It just has to be good. Fascinating stuff. And one of those stories that comes to mind is Gabriel Kaplan, who used to star in the hit television series Welcome Back, Kotter, put together a book of emails where these people were emailing him about specific, seemingly serious things, but then he would turn it into kind of a joke. And his responses, and he was amazed at how serious these people were actually taking him. So he goes on a book tour to share all this, and I thought, but why not break convention sometimes? Especially if you're not really going to hopefully hurt anybody. But it's really interesting how this all works.
Yeah, and I want to say, write to tell stories, but write for many reasons. Write to make people laugh. Write to play with language itself. Write to be a surrealist. Write to open people's minds. Write experimental poetry to just see what the nature of language is, to see what you can do in that fertile intersection of consciousness and writing. And I love that story of this guy taking people's emails and making them into a plaything. And I think that's one of the ways we get stuck is we think we have to deal with a problem on the same level at which it was created. And we don't. We can actually have a sense of delight and play and experimentation. And it's easy to say, but to actually just start trying to do it and to learn the techniques for doing it, really what I've devoted my life to.
Now, it's interesting because I can see the freedom that you allow within the groups that you actually work with. Of course, they're, I guess call it certain frameworks to work with, but the idea is to really get that free flow, to feel free, if you will.
Yeah.
And many, many years ago, as I worked in the restaurant business, I had a point where I was actually training people in the kitchen to cook. And it was interesting because what I would do is I would say to someone who would be new, okay, now what I'm going to show you is I'm going to show you what the outcome is, what we want to see. This is the standard this place wants for this particular dish, let's say. So I'm going to show you how I go about it, okay? But I want to let you know that once you can achieve this result, how you go about getting there is up to you. I'm just showing you the standard. Mm-hmm. And I think that helps people feel a relief and pressure knowing you're actually going to turn over the freedom to me after you show me how to do this. And the reason I did that is I would get people engaged in thinking about problem resolution. Right. And the more I was open to listening to people's ideas, Daniel, I know you showed me this way, but what do you think about this? And I'd say, that's kind of a fun improvement there, and we're still reaching the same result. So what? Who cares? Let's do it. And I'd share it with others. Then you had a team of people that were willingly creative, and that creates a hell of a lot of enthusiasm, which is exactly what writing should have a lot of, right?
Right. Yeah. So, I just want to recommend that people, if they want to reach out and contact me, they can. I also have a new book coming out next year, if I can tell people about it.
Absolutely.
I'm running out of time here. I'm also the author of a book called A Different Kind of Luxury, and it's coming out in a new edition next summer, and it is going to have a new title. It's going to be called The Abundance of Less, and what it is profiles of 10 men and women in rural Japan who are living really very simple lives with lots of time and lots of connection with each other, connection with the earth, connection with themselves. They don't engage in the whole striving of Japanese culture and the whole status game that's, believe it or not, even worse there in some ways than it is here. And they're really living great lives, growing their own food. Some of them are artists, potters. So it's going to be called The Abundance of Less. It's coming out next year. And I'm hoping in the next few years to take Writing Open the Mind and turning it into a game box. So if you want to find out more about what I do, it's just go over to theopening.org and sign up. Even teach online classes as well, book completion groups and writing from the subconscious online. So even if you don't live in the Northern California area, I'd love to.
Now, this wouldn't be the sequel to Selling Indulgence in Corporate Japan, would it?
Selling Indulgence in Corporate Japan. You've done your research. Actually, that is thank you for bringing that up. Selling Indulgence in Corporate Japan is part of one of the first books I conceived of, and I've written many essays on and published maybe 3 or 4 of them. And it's called Fry It How You Like It. I appreciate you bringing that up, Daniel, because I don't want to forget that that's an important book to me too. That's a little different. It's more about modern urban Japan and the field. I don't mention it so much, but the field of semiotics, which is the field of study of symbols and signs, and the way signs and symbols are different here and in Japan, and the way we understand each other. So that's yet a different book, but it's also on. Everything's on the front burner for me. I don't have back burners, but that will be coming forth soon as well.
Well, as you can see, Andy, certainly the world is rich, as well as the universe, of all types of ideas and opportunities for writing, just about an infinite amount of things that you can even conceive. And if you can't conceive it, I'm sure it'll show up anyway. And it's really important for people to know this, because we need to be able to express our creativity. And if you're getting into a mundane world of just day in and day out routine, that basically kind of extinguishes the soul, and the soul's meant to express itself. And writing is certainly one of the most fantastic ways a person can do that. And really, to me, the only way a person can really seemingly fail at something like this is if they just find themselves continuously getting in their own way. But that being said, why don't you write about why you think you do that? There you go. We got a whole new subject, don't we?
Or even you can just, instead of trying to stop getting in your own way, as long as you keep the pen moving, you could write in your own way. You could kind of exaggerate whatever it is that's getting in your own way. You can write towards it as opposed to trying to constantly write away from it and having the elastic band snap you back. So the idea is to really just, exaggerate the thing that you are trying to avoid. So if you're embarrassed, write something more embarrassing. If you get in your own way, as long as you keep the pen moving, you can write even more in that way. And at some point, you're going to actually respond by understanding what it is that maybe you're getting out of it, or that's feeding you, or that your subconscious mind thinks is feeding you. And that may be more illuminating than in analyzing why you get in your own way, essentially.
Not to mention, it only cropped up because it's a message trying to get through in the first place.
Yes,
Andy, thank you so much for being on the program today. Again, the book is Writing Open the Mind. And if you will, for our listeners, go ahead and give out that website one more time.
Okay, it's theopening.org. That's theopening.org. And I'm old school, so if people feel like calling on the telephone, I'll go ahead and give out my number. I give a free consultation to anyone who wants to talk about their writing. My phone number is 831-728-9983.
Very good. Andy, thank you so much for joining us here on the program. What a lot of fun this has been.
Thank you. Excuse me. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
You bet. We want to thank you, the listeners out there, for tuning in. You can also discover more. Visit us at beyond50radio.com. The number 50 is part of that right there. You can discover more. Also sign up for our free weekly e-newsletter. Stay up to date on what's going on with the Beyond 50 community, as well as upcoming shows and events. I'm Daniel Davis. Thank you for tuning in. This is the Beyond 50 radio program. And remember, live your day past halfway.